All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm Pastor Cain from Manuel Sheridan and Martin Luther Grammar School there. Today, I believe there is a need to recover classical dialectic and rhetoric as Christians, and especially as pastors and teachers. Just to tantalize you a little bit on things I didn't have time enough to include in this presentation and tomorrow's, let's try some Socratic questioning for Bible class in classrooms. I find it works out rather well. Let's use classical rhetoric for preaching and teaching. That will be much of what I cover today and tomorrow. And how about we reboot the Koinonia project of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod with disputation? I think that would be more fun and effective. Let's talk about catechesis. Dr. Tallmon says, Luther's Small Catechism is a grammar, the 6 chief parts, that employs logic, questions and explanations regarding the parts, not specifically including the with explanation that's put out by the Synod, and is structured rhetorically. What does this mean? This is most certainly true, and there's repeated use of poetic and rhetorical devices to facilitate memory, couplets and antitheses plenty. Luther is very comfortable with the tension that we have in the freedom of the Christian. When we usually hear the word rhetoric, it's tied to Washington or Austin or Cheyenne with the modifier empty. That's not what we're talking about here. Nor are we specifically talking about a rhetorical question, one asked in order to make a point, not get an answer because the answer is self-evident. We need the modifier of classical before the word rhetoric for our purpose of revival, because we are all taught rhetorics, and that will be the point of one of my future slides. So classical rhetoric, eloquence, beauty, and the art of persuasion with written and spoken language. We could quote a few other of our friends, Mrs. Swope. Rhetoric enables the student to write and speak with eloquence. Ancient Roman orator Quintilian urged the modeling of excellent speech even with very young children. When parents and teachers read poetry aloud, they bring beautiful examples of language to their children. As the student masters foundational and analytical elements of language, lessons in formal rhetoric become part of his classical education. And the sainted Reverend Heine, rhetoric refers to synthesizing new ideas from old facts. It leads to creativity, apology, as in the defense meaning, not the I'm sorry, and wisdom. And rhetoric cultivates imagination. Any discussion of the topic calls for the 3 appeals, modes of artistic proof. Ethos, your character, your credibility, good sense, good morals, good will. The messenger is part of the message. Logos, word, your argument, both the substance and the style. They cannot be separated, no matter what that fellow writing about worship in the 80s and 90s happened to say. And pathos, the emotions of your hearers. If you'd like a copy of these slides, feel free to email me afterwards. And there are the 5 canons of rhetoric. I would like to especially focus on arrangement, disposition. But first there is invention, brainstorming to build a case and fleshing out the issue using topics. Look for topica. I learned that Lotzi, topics is like a topographical map. And our new assistant pastor, Pastor Castellero, a graduate of Fort Wayne last year, he's been with us as a Wyomingite for well over a year now, he's one of us, recalls one of his young professors urging a commonplace book for each seminarian, each future pastor, to write himself. Arrangement is a persuasive order for your argument. This is really what I want to focus on. There is style, the best language for your ideas, and the last two are very integrated, memory and delivery. A few years ago, I did not have enough time in order to write out my midweek Advent sermon for that particular Wednesday. Too many emergencies, too many funerals in preparation, lots of chaos. So I left open my Lutheran study Bible, and I had an outline on a post-it note, and I preached a sermon. And I was scared. But I shouldn't have been. Wasn't I trained how to talk in front of people? But all of those years, probably 14 at that point, of preaching to shut-ins without my sermon manuscript, and since 2009, preaching at Near Daily Chapel at Martin Luther Grammar School, you get acclimated to preaching without a written manuscript. I don't necessarily recommend that for new preachers, but if you're a teacher, do you remember when you outgrew the teacher edition script in that first teacher's manual and you moved to your own voice? Preachers get to do that too. We don't necessarily write it all out and then memorize it and then talk it to you. It's often a lot better, in my experience, to be able to look at you while I'm talking. So, let's talk about classical rhetoric and training for preaching in the LCMS. It's not really fair. I was taught rhetorics. So, for the purpose of being true and accurate and fair, I went through my notes and my old assigned texts. The big book, Kimmer's Preaching for the Church, only specifically mentions rhetoric once, and I believe the word is used with a negative connotation in context. My fall 1997 St. Louis Homiletics 1 notes on day 1 mention Cicero. And this phrase, teach, delight, and persuade, as well as a dramatic change in sermon form in the 4th and 5th centuries. That happened on day 2 of class. Now, I did not come to Concordia St. Louis with Greek or Hebrew, so I didn't get Hom 1 till the fall of my 2nd year. Also, in bold print, the professor said, no change in content. They apparently used different rhetorics, but kept the same content, no matter which form of rhetoric they shared. My notes also share an article by Volz, V-O-L-Z, from Concordia Pulpit Resources, CPR, put breathe new life into your preaching. They never used that for a tagline for some reason. The article's called Preaching in the Early Church, and there's this quote. There's also considerable influence of classical rhetoric on the Christian sermon. This was most pronounced in the 4th and 5th centuries, when the sermon took place amidst great throngs of people in large basilicas. So big, long rectangles with maybe a bump out, because God hadn't invented microphones yet. Classical influence can be seen in exhortations to morality and in style, arrangement, and delivery. Augustine was very much influenced by Cicero in his homilies, the quote continues, and he even suggested, this is Augustine, that no pastor should preach who had not mastered the rudiments of classical oratory. That was in my assigned reading for the first week of preaching class, and we weren't taught the basic rudiments of classical oratory. By late October, we hear ethos, pathos, and logos with definitions. Later, I took a class called Sermon Structures. This did not cover classical oratory, but I aim to teach it and practice it. So, the second canon that we highlighted before in bold on a previous slide is dispositio, arrangement in detail. I have not had a class on this. I've had a cycle of readings from our friend Dr. Tallmon, and what other rabbit trails and fun places I've ended up to get myself into trouble. This is an outline of a speech, of a presentation, dare I say, a sermon, but just wait till the next slide. First you have the introduction, the exordium. Cicero says this is an ethos appeal, character expertise. If you as a pastor get up in front of the congregation that has called you, you can dispense with a lot of this, but you still need an engaging introduction to get everything rolling. Teachers, you are the teacher, even if it's a day long past since you wrote Miss or Mrs. name on the marker board. Next comes a logos appeal, the statement of facts. After that, here you have the proposition, points of agreement and disagreement. A logos appeal, again according to Cicero. The fourth part is confirmatio, proofs. This is the deliberative argument. This is an appeal to the content, the word. Literally, the word, if you're a Christian preacher. Your first proof, your second proof, your third proof. After that, what do you do with competing views? We rebut them. We defend the true confession of the faith once delivered to the saints. So you can see whether a teacher or a homeschool parent or a preacher, you're appealing to the word, the facts, and literally the word of God when it comes to a sermon. Now, if you've got a congregation or students that can stand you talking longer, this is when you can deal with some optional related issues, sidebars, the things that you might find in a box on a side column of whatever it is for dummies, right? You know those books? And then finally, the summary and final statement of purpose. And this is often an emotional appeal. I have a little personal experience with that as part of a funeral sermon. On 2 occasions in my life, I've buried multiple people in the same day. My last work day at my previous call, we had a joint LCMS funeral for 2 sisters raised in the same congregation, both LCMS to the day they died on the same day, 500 miles apart, 15 minutes apart. Pastor, could we have their funeral together? Of course. We had 3 LCMS pastors do that service together, and then I needed to excuse myself from my afternoon funeral while those other 2 pastors took care of the gravesides. And then conducted a funeral for another faithful member of that previous congregation that afternoon. After 9 years or so in Sheridan, Wyoming, and it's been a long time since that pair of funerals, I buried in the same day 2 trustees, one who told me to stop scooping my own drive and to stop mowing my own lawn. And being the son of my father, that was, I could hardly imagine that. But I buried both of those guys on the same day, and it's hard not to let just a little emotion come through when you too are a mourner and you too are looking for the resurrection of all flesh and the reunion of all the saints. So sometimes a pathos appeal comes accidentally and not on purpose. But arrangement can happen on purpose, and there's a new book called Remember the Poor by Matthew Harrison, How the Earliest Christians Cared for the Needy. It has a copyright date of 2018, but it has a dedication date in the foreword of 2008. I don't know why, but those are the facts. In one chapter, he points out the introduction, statement of facts, points of agreement, disagreement, the proofs, and a summary and statement of purpose for 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He posits that St. Paul did this, that St. Paul used classical rhetoric. So let's put it to the test. The introduction claimed is verses 1 through 5 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Verses 1 through 5. The statement of facts is set out as verse 6. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. There are points of agreement and disagreement, as you can well imagine, because this is a stewardship text. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. After that, verses 9 through 15 form 3 different proofs. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Luther may call that the great exchange. And in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now, finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, not equality, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. That's the end of verse 15. Our congregation in Sunday morning Bible class is doing Exodus verse by verse, and the manna showed up that particular Sunday when this was the 3-year lectionary Series B epistle. Really nice timing, I'd say. After that, there is a departure from a classical rhetorical arrangement. And that would be the Commendation of Titus, which I don't need to read for you. We commend him too. And then we end up with a summary and final statement of purpose, which I did add to the pericope for that day. So, give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. President Harrison shares this from another commentary on 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, but his prior connection to a classical Lutheran school, I think, shows a bit in very clearly laying out these points even more so than the commentary that he quotes. He does the same thing with 2 Corinthians chapter 9 in the introduction, statement of facts, proposition, proofs, and summary and final state of purpose. So, let's transition to sermon and homily. There are a couple of views, and I stand to be corrected if I need to be. Is a sermon the same thing as a homily? Wilhelm Leah in The Pastor, published by Concordia, says a homily is more simple. A speech is not necessarily based on a text of Scripture. A homily and a speech can be combined, but a sermon follows the pattern of ancient rhetoric. Leah, the founder of the Deaconess School there in Germany and of the Fort Wayne Seminary before it moved and then moved back yet to a different campus. George Kennedy in Classical Rhetoric and its Christian and Secular Tradition posits, the homily is the third and most important kind of Christian preaching after apologetic, sorry for the typo, and polemic. Homilia and sermo both mean conversation. And I think this linguistically helps prove the point that dialectic, related to dialogue, and rhetoric belong as a pair with common roots. Either could refer to preaching that is more simple in style or more structured. So I'm trying to define the terms based on the usage of wherever we get our source. I'd like to highlight several books here at this point, and then we will return to Leah for a very interesting reason. This is a book called Luther's Rhetoric by Neal. It's 2002, Concordia Publishing House. Strategies and Style from the Invocavit Sermons. This provides ample rhetorical analysis of 8 sermons of Dr. Luther. Unfortunately, it is soporific. I would personally like something a little more exciting, but it does get the job done. When did Luther preach these? The first Sunday of Lent, Invocavit, in the following week in 1522. He is just back in Wittenberg from the Wartburg Castle. They lay out Luther's plan and method for church reform. Because, remember, he had to come back. Things were going awry. Is that putting the best construction on it? This is a book that serves well as an analysis of exemplars, not exactly a how-to method on how to modify Luther's rhetoric for your own use in 2018 and beyond. This is another book I highly recommend, but it is highly expensive, but I still highly recommend it. Cicero in Heaven is the title. It's less about the eternal salvific status of Marcus Tullius Tully Cicero, or, yeah, Cicero, I get it, in the Christian afterlife, though there is some reference to this on page 83, if you're detail-oriented like me. And it's more about the use of Cicero's words, example, and techniques by Luther. I can give you exact page numbers if you want. Melanchthon, Sturm, and Johann Sebastian Bach. Cicero and Bach. I mean, for a classical Lutheran educator, that's like heaven, right? Did you know that Cicero's works were among the first books to be printed after the Gutenberg Bible? Cicero, this dead Roman senator.
At the worship conference in River Forest last year, about a year ago, Professor David Schmidt, who is a homiletics professor at St. Louis, in one of the sectionals, demonstrated a similarity in style and format between some of Luther's sermons and classical rhetoric, including some from Cicero. It was a fascinating workshop.
All right, I need to catch up with him. That would be fascinating. Springer is the author. He notes that there's a strong historic tendency within Christianity to oppose the kind of careful, trained eloquence associated with Cicero's name. You believe it? Cicero got a bad rep among Lutherans? Yet a prominent teacher of rhetoric, eventually appointed advisor to Constantine, Lactantius, am I saying that name? I was told not to make fun of people who mispronounce words that they've only learned through reading. He was called Cicero Christianus, by Mirandola because of the graceful eloquence of his style, although some of his theological positions were deemed less than orthodox. Now that's putting the best construction on things. In contrast to an oration in the style of Cicero, the more common Christian practice, Springer asserts, was the more informal homily. So he starts to come down on a difference between those vocabulary words. Augustine himself preached frequently without extensive notes and sometimes even without the biblical text before him. Springer has more. The church, as Luther described it, is not a pen house but a mouth house, because it is through speaking to each other in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs that the most important work of the church is done, whether it be in the form of praying, teaching, preaching, confession, or worship. Luther knew and appreciated the 5 traditional categories of rhetoric. As a Nebraska fan, I go touchdown when I'm excited. Luther's style in Freedom of a Christian, quoted by Pastor Paul this morning during his session, is certainly closer to the hypotactic periodic style of Cicero's prose than to the clipped sentences and paratactic diction of the Vulgate with which he was so familiar. Maybe Professor Schmidt has been reading Springer too. I'd like to think so. That would be awesome. Springer claims that Cicero was an influence on the American founders. Many Lutherans in America, especially Walther, Roy, and then Leah, who was a great influence in America but never left Germany. The latter's book was very important to me, and I'll get to that in good time. So, written and delivered from memory, or delivered from an outline and notes? Well, you can buy the book and find out the answer. I don't like to spoil all the fun stuff. I asked the author and my fellow readers and the group today and those watching, whether written down or delivered with minimal notes, why could preachers today not use the same kind of outline for a Lutheran sermon? You can do it. On July 1st, I followed the outline when I preached on this text. And by focusing on, I'm going to teach you an ancient outline, I was hoping to disarm them from the content while the content soaked in. All right. Yeah, sneaky is sometimes on purpose, right? Springer introduces his reader to other topics familiar to you. The Trivium, the establishment of Christian academic institutions. We learned that Melanchthon, of course, lectured on Cicero, referenced him in his textbooks, including Melanchthon's 2 books on rhetoric, which you can get from books.google.com, and have them printed by your espresso book machine institution of choice and shipped to you wherever you are, and then you can practice your Latin as well as learn some rhetoric. Melanchthon, Springer says, divided the ideal sermon, like an oration, into familiar components. And I've already showed those to you. Luther did this, St. Paul did this, Melanchthon did this, yet there's a gap somewhere. Not everybody was a fan of Cicero's rhetoric. Why? Springer answers, Latin began now often to be identified closely with Roman Catholicism. Cicero was called a papist. Seriously? Do you even know the man at all? Matthias Flacius Illyricus was one of the main contributors to the anti-Ciceronian movement. The last pages of the book, I think, are fascinating, especially for attendees and members of the consortium. It mentions CCLE. It mentions the Wittenberg Academy. Again, there is now a small but growing classical education movement among denominational Christian educators in America, beginning already in '89 with Douglas Wilson's Logos School in Moscow, Idaho. A modestly impressive number of Christian schools and homeschooling organizations have embraced a curriculum featuring Latin on all levels, focusing on the traditional skills taught in the Trivium, often drawing on Dorothy Sayers' 1947 essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. I mean, isn't it fun when we hear the same things over and over in the same day? Rhetoric, Latin, and Cicero figure prominently in such curricula. Some of the schools, like Wittenberg Academy, are Lutheran in orientation. Whether classical Christian education is a movement that is really sweeping America, that's one of Dr. Beatt's co-authored books, remains to be seen, but the amount and degree of interest in the movement suggests that the final chapter on the faithful and vexed relationship between Cicero and Christianity, however short it may be, may have yet to be written. This book is about $125.
It's on sale right now.
So you need to tell us.
Sweet, it's on sale?
But there's only one left.
But there's only one left. All right. I basically figured out that I was the ideal intended audience of this book. And I think you are too. I've been working my way through the Cicero volumes of the Loeb Classical Library, while for fun, reading the Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris. And you have to wait till the third volume before he acknowledges he used Loeb in trying to reconstruct the lost Cicero biography by Tiro. All right. Melanchthon and Rhetoric. Anybody know the name Timothy Keller? Yeah. I bought a book by Timothy Keller on purpose for 5 pages of footnotes. The Puritans and their heirs went on to develop a very scholastic classical outline for each sermon with a single proposition, a rigorous analysis of it, and an exhaustive defense and application of it. Where did they get this form? Keller explains that the classical arrangement, or dispositio, and then introduces Philip Melanchthon and his Elements of Rhetoric 1521, and his new synthesis of ancient oratory for the use of Christian preachers. All right, so preachers in the room. It's no longer law, gospel, and response, as we misunderstood from Cameron. Melanchthon says, exegetical introduction, who, what, how, why. I guess Melanchthon invented reporters. And then application. Among Puritans, sermons arranged this way were less expository and more topical thematic, or catechetical. Puritan sermons that were catechetical? Anyway, Keller says this led to more thematic preaching. So yeah, I bought a book for 5 pages of footnotes. Probably did some of my seminary professors proud on that. Now we're getting back to Leah. Reverend Wilhelm Leah's Pastoral Theology, The Pastor, CPH 2015, includes an open letter by Johann Eberlin, written in 1525. This was part of my advertisement from yesterday. Eberlin is a contemporary of Luther himself, and this is a very long, wonderful open letter. 14th. The rhetoricians and professional speakers have written several things that may be useful to you to show you the proper formal presentation of your teaching, whose rules and ways are shown by rhetoric, as well as how to understand the writing of other teachers. You should not despise this, for the Holy Spirit does not use a miraculous funnel to pour things into you, as long as you can have a thing in a natural way. Therefore, Do not neglect to read what Cicero, Quintilian, Erasmus, Philip Melanchthon, and others write about this or have written. Where's Aristotle? I don't know. I think Aristotle would be easier in the Greek, but yeah, 1525. This paragraph was the touch point that inspired a course in classical study. I took a photograph of that paragraph, sent it to Dr. Tallmon, and begged him for a book list. I'm only 20% through the book list. And this is what I have so far, brother. I can't wait to finish, but will I ever be finished? Okay. And then there's Tuesdays with Tallmon. If you haven't signed up for it yet, is there still time? They can catch up.
Yes, we have room.
Okay, there still is room. There still is room. But a warning to you, and this is not the books you need to read and why. That was yesterday. You're going to have to buy more books. Sorry, not sorry. All right, here's another gem. Johann Gerhard. We're finally getting the complete Lotzi, commonplaces, the complete Lutheran theology topographical map. And this is one of the newest volumes. I put off reading it too long, and I've just had to read it and reread it. On Interpreting Sacred Scripture is one part of the book. I'm going to be quoting from Method of Theological Study. There is another translation of that about. In that part of the book, Gerhard lays out a 5-year course for theological education. You thought 3 years plus vicarage was a lot for your pastor or yourself. 5 years. On Training and Preaching is chapter 2 of year 4. I just need to have that sink in for a little bit. Furthermore, just as rhetoricians define 5 functions of speech, there they are, again, and again, and again, so also these can be considered in the preacher or churchly orator. Thus, according to these 5 parts, we shall specify rules that are helpful to keep from making and giving sermons to the people. It's not just education for education's sake. It's education and rhetoric for the sake of vocation, and the preacher's vocation is preaching to the people, properly distinguishing the law and gospel. Now, I apologize, this is way too small, but I wanted to give you some of the more interesting highlights for each of the different parts. Under invention, advice number 2, Gerhard says, one should be far more sparing still in quoting heathen sayings of the pagans or secular stories. I've had secular stories just backfire on me. Under arrangement, advice number 4, the transitioning from the opening to the proposition should be a gradual descent, not a free fall. Under style, advice item number 1, words and ways of speaking in sermon should be proper, clear, and set forth even for the uneducated to grasp. Therefore, they should not be folksy or corrupting. Neither should they smack of the prince's court. Rather, they should take the middle ground so as to follow the proper use of the vernacular language. Regarding memory, this is advice item number 7. No one should be so confident of his memory that in the act of preaching he refuses to have a piece of paper with him on which he has written down the main sections of the sermon. That convicted me a little bit, so maybe I should graduate from my Post-it note. But then, of his mammoth marathon tour of all the district conventions, President Harrison posted a photo of his sermon outline on social media. It was his airline ticket, upside down on the back. That was his outline of his sermon. And I heard the same one in Casper, Wyoming. Delivery. This shows you how smart my wife is. She taught me this before Gerhard did. Advice number 5. Those who are beginning practice in sermons should especially strive for slowness in delivery, for slowness of speech is easier to correct later than is excessive haste. I know, you talk faster when you're trying to proclaim the whole counsel of God as a teacher or all right, Roy and Rhetoric. Roy's Homiletics, a manual for the theory and practice of preaching from the 1920s, gives a foundation for classical rhetoric in preaching. Chapter 17, 30 pages. He makes reference to Dabney's Sacred Rhetoric of 1870, building on the shoulders of those who came before him, and Dabney claims Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, and Horace in his preface. So I guess I need to read Horace now, Dr. Tallmon. He employs another Christian rhetoric, apologetics, to defend arrangement, disposition in Christian and Lutheran preaching. So this guy must have been classically educated because he's trying to use all of the details. I'd like to pause there, so I have a little bit more to present for you tomorrow, and Dr. Tallmon can truly tag team it, both of us up at the front, and then explore some of these other parts of classical rhetoric and take loads and loads of questions. Does that sound fair? All right. Good. Any questions at this point for today? I do thank you for your hearing. Sir?
I just have one thing I've been sitting on for a while. When you were discussing Springer,
yeah,
I just wanted to highlight with everyone that the schools that I've been to have a strong tendency to emphasize written rhetoric, composition, because there are the textbooks in composition rhetoric are more clear and plainly put, and the direction is easier to follow, I think. But you make a really good case, actually, the people you're reading make a really good case for the primacy of orality in the study of rhetoric. We really need to preserve that. Because even when you consider just loving one's neighbor and speaking the truth in love to one's neighbor and being attentive to hear what they're saying and then respond well, listening critically, and all, that's all related somehow to rhetorical skill. And so I think it's really important to preserve that emphasis, even though it's less cut and dry.
On the matter of delivery, I am coming up on 26 years as a pastor. I still write out a manuscript to save me from rambling or forgetting to preach. Oh, I forgot to preach the cross, or to substitute with volume or passion for substance. So I still write out the manuscript. I try not to be tied to it. I have it in the pulpit. I try to make eye contact. I've got it pretty much inside of me, so that I only just have to look down. But I know the first few years of being a preacher, I was writing more like I was writing an essay to be read. Now I have learned how to write for oral delivery. What's going to come off my tongue naturally. And in the first years of ministry, it takes you a few years to get there.
I would agree. Professor Schmidt that you mentioned before was really, really good in person. To hear him preach is just an amazing thing, because we'd always have questions at the home class after a chapel where he preached, and that was wonderful. He encouraged us to write for orality. Say it aloud after you write it down.
Yeah.
Your sentence may be far too complex, too Greek, too German, take your pick. Make it so it's digestible orally, and that was very, very handy. I found that the most work I have to put into a sermon without a written manuscript, after I've got the exegetical work, the doctrinal work, the outline in my head or on the paper, is the ending. so it just doesn't sputter
Yeah.
to an end. That it's intentional, it's Jesus, it's cross. If you could preach a sermon or turn in a sermon to Professor Schmidt or any of the homiletical faculty at St. Louis when I was there, if the sermon could survive without the cross and Good Friday and Easter, it's not a Christian sermon.
Correct.
You get an F.
Mhm.
Thank God. Never did, but I mean, thank God you get an F, because that would be a failure. Yeah, please.
The distinction between impromptu speaking, extemporaneous speaking, and oratory is the degree of manuscript that's used. And oratory is supposed to be highly polished, and so using a manuscript is totally expected, but being tied to the manuscript is not acceptable.
Mhm.
It's not inspiring.
I expect
It's not
annotations,
engaging.
like we heard yesterday.
So that if we wanted a copy, we could email you?
Yes.
What's your email address?
One of them is webmaster@ccle.org. That's probably the easiest one. And if you allow me a couple of days to revise and extend my remarks, I'll get something to you. We also intend to have video and papers, whether PDF or PowerPoint, on the comprehensive media page. That's really grown in the last 13 months. Maybe you've noticed it.
Pastor Cain's archiving a lot of material there.
Yeah, there's not enough room on this for my 13,000 Logos books and the complete CCLE archive, so I've got a separate hard drive just for all of that. And we've got recordings all the way back to 2003 that still need a bit of editing before we put them up.
Thank you.
Please come back tomorrow.